Warhammer 40,000 has been around for over 30 years, dominating the landscape of sci-fi wargaming since 1987. In that time, there have been 10 editions of the game, with the latest being released in July of 2023, and over the years the game's background has been changed, added to, references have been removed, hints dropped, and things have been entirely retconned. The rules are no exception. Each edition brings changes, updates, refreshes, tweaks, and in a number of cases, a complete overhaul of the system. Some have been met with rejoicing, others derision, and others complete indifference. But regardless, they all guide players on the basics and in some cases the advanced parts of the game. Welcome to Tabletop Tactics. My name is Mike, otherwise known as the Chef, and I've been playing 40k for over 20 years. And in this video, we're going to go over a brief history of the core rules of Warhammer 40,000 and how they've changed. And obviously, there's a lot to go through, so I'm not going to go through everything, but whether you're a veteran looking to wax nostalgic or a brand new player interested in how the game of yesteryear worked, we will dive into some of these rules that have formed the game over its life and brought it to where it is today. It all started in 1987. The first edition of 40k, otherwise known as Rogue Trader, was effectively just a sci-fi adaptation of the already existing Warhammer Fantasy battle rules, itself starting as a system to allow the running of massed battles for RPG games such as Dungeons and Dragons. As such, there was a strong RPG influence, with much more in-depth rules to affect units in-game, such as hiding behind walls or being encumbered by heavy war gear, even having your squad leaders order models away to do something more esoteric on the battlefield. This even extended to the dice being used, with the rules suggesting to have at least one of the iconic RPG dice, a D4, a D8, all the way up to a D20, and about a dozen or so D6s, which compared to nowadays isn't a huge amount. These, and many other rules, required a GM to adjudicate, meaning a game of 40k usually needed 3 players to happen. As such, games of Rogue Trader were a detailed and in-depth affair, heavily driven by narrative on the field, crunchy numbers and modifiers, and the whims of the GM who could decide the outcome of an intended play. Again, much like the RPG systems the original fantasy system was based on. Now, this section is going to be quite long, as so much of what was introduced in Rogue Trader was continued or refined over the following editions, and some is still used even today, so it's important to give some context. Many of the core characteristics will be familiar to you, with weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, wounds, so on, all being used today. Perhaps slightly different in their implementations and interactions, but their core purpose is still the same. Others such as movement and initiative have come and gone in some capacity, whilst others like willpower were completely removed in 2nd edition as some of the RPG elements were stripped away. With many of the core concepts of the game still existing today, such as the I go, you go sequence, 2-inch coherency, the wounding table for instance was virtually unchanged all the way into 7th edition, whereas other aspects such as damage and save modifiers went away and then came back. The game still followed the basic move, then shoot, then fight in turn order. Charging was not its own phase and indeed wouldn't be for several editions, instead needing to be declared in the movement phase instead of acting normally. Models even had arcs of fire, so facing them was important. You could only see in a 90-degree arc in front of you, you couldn't fire behind you through your foot. Further to this, models could rotate up to 90 degrees for free after they finished their move, but anything more cost them movement to do so. Given games were a much smaller affair, this isn't as cumbersome as it sounds. Remember that these early editions of 40k were more akin to a scaled-up role-playing game rather than a full-scale battle, so this individualistic style for models was the norm. Weapons were a much more involved system, numerous hit modifiers based on how big the target was or how fast they were moving, what kind of cover they had, and the ballistic skill system was a comparative table. The general rule was 7 take away your ballistic skill was what was needed to hit, and this rolled all the way through into 7th edition and is still used in games of Heresy today, albeit a little bit more simplified. There's not quite as many modifiers. Wounding was also based on a comparative table where the strength of the attack was compared to the target's toughness. Again, much like now, although with some slight differences. Saving throws had modifiers as well, both positive and negative depending on the weapon type, before inflicting damage as determined by the weapon. Most weapons were 1, but some particularly heavy weapons such as lascannons could range into the D6, D10s, maybe even 2d6 range. Close combat, or hand-to-hand as it was known then, was also an involved section, with rules to run away from chargers, shooting at them, models and units being able to charge individually from their unit as long as they still maintained coherency range, and even attacking arcs the same as with shooting, although particularly big monsters could attack behind them or to their sides with things such as tails or claws. Higher initiatives would fight first regardless of who charged who, and weapon skills were compared to give a minimum number required to hit. Now the table did range up to a 9, obviously impossible on a d6, but as you could imagine, there were a plethora of modifiers and negatives. Combats were won by the side who inflicted more wounds to their opponent, with the losing side being pushed back 2 inches on the tabletop, and the winners were able to pursue and press the advantage, creating slowly shifting battle lines as combat spilled across the table. Of course, losing a melee also caused a rout check, taken by rolling 2d6 and looking for their leadership value or lower to pass. They could also occur when losing 33% of their unit in a turn of shooting, if they tried to move away from a combat in their turn, or quite literally whenever the GM felt like it. Failing a rout check would immediately result in the unit in question moving 4 inches away from their nearest threat, and the only thing they were allowed to do would be to continue at double their movement towards the nearest table edge, and they were removed from the game once they reached it. Rallying fleeing troops was possible, again a leadership check required, and even then in the turn after they would have restrictions like being unable to move further or fire slow or heavy weapons. They were easy to hit in combat and could cause possible downsides to friendly units around them, so a routing unit became a big liability. There was also a section of the game called reserve moving, which effectively allowed a unit that hadn't done anything that turn to move again. There was also psychology tests, a big holdover from the fantasy system, and these would account for how troops would behave on the battlefield, being tested on a cool characteristic. And it was tested when certain scenarios happened, such as being attacked or even just seeing a particular kind of enemy. For example, hated enemies would force movement and charges into them, but they were unable to flee from them. Vehicles were also a much more involved affair, with rules on acceleration rates and turning ratios, so you needed to have paid attention in maths class in order to know how to use them. There were damage charts to indicate severe damage suffered in a single turn, ranging from losing control of your vehicle, weapons falling off, or becoming a ticking time bomb that might explode in later turns. Psychic powers, or psionics, also operated on vastly different levels, with a pool of psychic points used by the psykers to fuel their abilities. More powerful psykers had access to larger psychic points and access to more potent and expensive powers. Some of these were quite simple, ranging from improving armor saves or causing direct damage to the enemy. The most powerful psykers, however, could cause time to repeat and give the controlling player an entire additional phase, or prevent your opponent from acting in a phase. Given its RPG leanings and origins, missions in Rogue Trader were predominantly determined by the GM, based on a narrative of their design or randomly generated from a series of plot points, making games an entirely story-driven affair. This was an era when 40k had just started, and given the lack of models produced and its RPG-based gameplay, customization and randomly generated stats were an accepted part of the game, especially for vehicles or monsters, hence the need for the GM. It was actually in an effort to allow players to have a game without a GM that necessitated the point system in order to act as the quote-unquote arbiter of the balance of the two sides. But as the years progressed, the game's popularity took off and a newer, slightly more streamlined version was eventually introduced. Published in 1993, the second edition of 40k refined much of the gameplay aspects into a much more focused skirmish wargame, stripping back quite a fair bit of the RPG elements, although not removing them entirely. The GM was no longer required, as there were full faction rules and army lists, things that were slowly introduced over time in the White Dwarf magazines during the life of Rogue Trader, but now enshrined in codex form, alongside the War Gear book, which contained the myriad equipment usable by the various factions. Army structure was more limited, with certain amounts of points needed to be spent on standard units, as well as needing to be drawn from certain army lists. Gone too were the random characteristic tables used to make up units that didn't have models, and some of the more esoteric elements that needed a GM to provide rulings on were completely gone. Many things did stay the same, however, with stat lines pretty much as they are, although the psychology-based stats of intelligence, cool, and willpower were all rolled into leadership, but coherency, wounding, saving throws, and modifiers all remained pretty much the same. Some new additions were made, however, such as shooting attacks needing to be made at the closest possible target, although of course with some exceptions. Units had to fire at the same targets as well where possible, accounting for arcs of fire, or could turn their anti-tank guns on the closest vehicle instead. Measuring distances also could not happen until after declaration of targets. You had to judge if you were in charging or shooting range before confirming if they were an eligible target. Hitting at range still followed the same basic procedure, with a range of modifiers and comparison of ballistic skill, although this edition did introduce the specific scatter dice for weapons that used area of effects attacks. Rolled in conjunction with the special artillery dice when an attack missed, these resulted in the shot veering off target, failing completely, or misfiring onto the attacking model's unit and destroying the weapon in question. Flamer templates were also introduced in this edition, and they, along with sustained fire, replaced the follow-through type of first edition, those particularly potent weapons that could essentially fire multiple shots or affect a swathe of the battlefield. Hand-to-hand combat was drastically different, however, with every combat being done on a model-by-model basis, rolling a d6 for each attack that they had, using the highest score, adding weapon skills, any other modifiers, and then comparing totals with each other. The player with the higher total won the fight and inflicted the difference of the totals as hits on the opposing model. Initiative were used to break ties rather than who fought first. Fighting arcs were removed, and modifiers included things such as critical hits, bonuses for charging, as well as ways to force rerolls on your opponent's dice with parrying style weapons like swords. Following up was still here, but only when an enemy model was slain, and breaking away was still possible, but done during combat, automatically causing the unit to have their morale broken. All of this combined made combats a very interesting affair where every individual model would have their own epic duel, but long and protracted melee would slow the game down to a crawl. It's very telling that this version of combat did not last longer than this edition, as 40k progressed further into a system allowing for larger battles. Morale, as mentioned, became the new name for routing, with units needing to take break tests for 25% casualties suffered in a given phase, a lower figure than the 33% from Rogue Trader, but was otherwise tested in the same way. There were other certain elements to it, however, like rallying could only be done if they were behind cover, if the closest visible friendly models weren't broken, or if they were above 25%. This could lead to a horrible cascade where some broken units prevented others from rallying, and so they're forced to cower behind cover next to each other for the rest of the game. Whilst Rogue Trader had basic rules for hero-type characters, Second codified them a little bit more, adding easier rules for letting these models lead units, giving them access to war gear rather than the random tables of the past, and having you choose a specific hero as a commander of the force, with some associated rules for allowing units to rally a bit easier. They also introduced special characters to the game, and psychic powers were also much more streamlined, at least until expansions were released later in the edition's life, with the psi point system gone and the number and power of the abilities much reduced. Vehicles still followed some of the conventions of Rogue Trader, although turning and speed of movement was simplified with flat values for certain speeds. However, attacking vehicles became a much more involved affair, with each hit needing to randomly determine which part of the model was struck, and depending on the arc of the facing, how tough that segment would be with a given armor value, a change from the unified toughness value that all units had in Rogue Trader. By rolling a d6 and adding the weapon's strength and the damage, but only if it was a variable amount, as well as bonuses in melee depending on the strength. Look, there was a lot of stuff going on with vehicles, but it really boiled down to one of two things. Do you blow off a bit of the tank, or do you blow up the whole tank? Some hits would cause it to lose these weapons, a tank track would fall off, others would cause chain reactions or cause it to explode outright. It's a similar system to that of Rogue Trader, but one that felt more in depth on the tabletop and was bespoke to individual vehicles, with different vehicles having different damage tables. Missions for second edition were much more linear and defined than any of the GM concocted scenarios of Rogue Trader could have ever been, as victory points were awarded for damaging and destroying enemy units, particularly those of high value, as well as primary and sometimes secondary objectives generated from mission cards, which could be agreed upon or randomly determined depending on the player's agreements. If that sounds familiar, you'd be correct. Now, as further expansions to psychic powers, war gear were released, codexes came along throughout the edition's life, the complexities and interactions became much more substantial, despite the apparent intent of the edition. Now, moving away further from its RPG roots would happen again in 1998, the first big reset of 40k. Whilst much of the core principles remain the same, the third edition of 40k laid the groundwork for what could be considered modern 40k. The rules became an exclusive D6 system, although the core characteristics remained the same. Movement, however, was removed and wouldn't return for several editions. Likewise, the basic turn structure remained fairly similar, movement, shooting and close assault still being in their normal order. Now all infantry models moved a basic 6 inches, and facing and firing arcs for models were also a thing of the past, models being turned in the shooting phase more for dramatic effect than any in-game rules purposes. Shooting continued the trend of similar but different, with the aforementioned facing no longer being a concern, but all units were forced to shoot at the same target. Units also operated more cohesively, with one model moving making the whole unit counting as moving. Hitting and wounding remained the same, but modifiers were completely removed. Saving throws were also revamped, with the removal of the modifier system and the introduction of flat AP values, or armor penetration. Weapons all had flat values, which outright ignored saves of that particular value or worse, so a bolter with an AP of 5 would ignore anything with a save of 5 or 6. To this end, force field type saves remained much the same as they were in second, now called invulnerable saves. Cover became a new variant of save rather than affording a modifier to hit, and both of these types of saves offered set values that couldn't be ignored by AP. A 4+ cover save became the rallying cry of many events and gaming stores for years to come. The changes to a single D6 system necessitated some changes to weaponry and damage inflicted, as it was no longer a characteristic itself, and instead everything would just do a single wound, no matter what. If, however, the strength was at least double their toughness, that single wound would inflict instant death, removing the model as a casualty immediately. 3rd edition introduced some more weapon types, most of which exist in some form to this day. Things like rapid fire, assault, heavy, as well as blast and template weapons, and the removal of the sustained weapon attacks. Instead, weapons just fired more shots, shooting weapons actually having an attacks characteristic for the very first time. Charge moves were now declared at the start of the assault phase, allowing units to move into range and then engage in melee in the same turn, although any unit that fired a rapid fire or heavy weapon could not declare a charge, making them need to trade off for firepower. Models had to move into base to base if possible, starting with the closest models in the most direct manner, and for the first time, models not in base to base could fight. Instead, as long as they were within 2 inches of an enemy model. Attacking was akin to shooting with the removal of modifiers or individual comparisons of dice rolls and weapon skill, and instead you simply made a number of attacks equal to your profile, and a certain number was needed to hit. Regardless of what the opponent was, you had to compare your weapon skills. Initiative was also reverted to its rogue trader incarnation, determining who fought first, allowing particularly fast units to get the drop on the foe and do enough damage to mitigate their output even when charged. Combat results were determined in the same manner as Rogue Trader, with the losing side needing to take a morale check, falling back should they fail. In this instance, however, the winner could perform a sweeping advance. Both players would compare a 2d6 roll, and if the attacker won, they would destroy them completely, even moving into a fresh enemy unit if they were in their direct path. Alternatively, they could consolidate, moving 3 inches in any direction. Morale in 3rd edition operated as a blend of 1st and 2nd, tests being needed for casualties in the shooting phase, but with a 25% ratio such as in 2nd, losing combats as noted above. Vehicles could also tank shock by running through enemy units and causing them to flee before their behemoth might. Various modifiers would apply to morale checks, such as being below 50% of your starting strength or being outnumbered when losing a melee. But regardless of how or when they failed morale, a failure did result in a fallback move. 2d6 that had to go towards the player's board edge. Did not prevent them shooting, but could result in immediate destruction if they ran through an enemy unit, otherwise known as the crossfire rule. Characters followed a similar pattern to 2nd edition, access to bespoke war gear and rules, being able to lead units innately, or being able to jump between them in the case of especially powerful independent characters. Psychers were trimmed back even further, being limited to a single power return, but the risk of having their head exploded was finally introduced with Perils of the Warp. Vehicles were likewise simplified, with armor values just being based on front, side or rear facings rather than whatever the particular part or component that was hit. All vehicles could move up to 12, although particularly fast ones could move further than that, up to 24, whereas walkers, such as the classic Dreadnought, only 6, much like infantry. With these changes to movement, wheeling and turning a vehicle was no longer costing you movement, making their positioning a relatively simple affair, but on the flip side, a tank could become immediately immobilized when going through certain terrain types. Many battle plans were ruined by an errant tree stump. Transportation rules were also a simplified matter, with units being able to embark and disembark either before or after a vehicle had moved, though in any case, they could not go any further than 12 unless they had disembarked before it moved. Shooting was limited with vehicles despite their advantages and speeds, needing to remain stationary in order to fire all of their guns, and the number that they could fire changed depending on how far they moved as well as what type they were. Ordnance weapons were also introduced, massive weapons like battle cannons that would prevent the vehicle from doing literally anything else that turn, but were devastating in their effects. Attacking vehicles became a more simple method as well, with all armor penetration being calculated by the simple strength of the weapon and a d6. Equaling the armor value of the vehicle caused a glancing hit, beating it caused a penetrating hit. You would then roll a further d6 on a particular damage table, whether it's glancing, penetrating, or with ordnance weapons, their own bespoke table, doing varying degrees of damage, much similar to the tables of 2nd, but for all vehicles as a whole, rather than individual components and individual vehicles. Melee attacks were also simplified, automatically hitting stationary tanks, hitting on a 4+ against vehicles that had moved, or 6s against anything that had moved fast, or was a skimmer, such as the iconic Falcon Grav tank. Dreadnoughts were the exception, however, because they actually had a weapon skill. Ramming other vehicles was also sadly removed, but you could try and run over other units with the tank shock as mentioned earlier, forcing them to flee or move to the side. A single brave model, however, could stand their ground for a death or glory attack, shooting with a single shot from a single weapon that automatically hits, but unless it stopped the tank, they would end up squished. 3rd edition also introduced a much more structured way of playing missions. There are a set of 5 standard ones with varying objectives that both players would aim to achieve, such as holding particular points on the battlefield. 9 additional scenarios were there as well, which were much more focused around a particular theme, such as sabotaging a key location or breaking out of an attacker's ambush. It's worth noting that some special rules like infiltrators or deep striking could only be used in certain missions, as narratively it would not make sense to have these rules in effect in certain scenarios. Victory points were also in effect for certain missions, which were now based solely on the value of the units that were damaged or destroyed and contributing to the overall mission score. 3rd edition lasted for 6 years, tied with Rogue Trader as the longest lasting version of the core rules, and at that time probably the most popular version there had been. But over that time, a number of addendums, trial rules and updates were added in White Dwarf and the chapter-approved compilations. Things like updates and clarifications to transport rules, or making units only eligible to charge targets that they had shot at in the previous term. As there were multiple sources for rules, and some of these changes were quite big, and certainly how certain elements interacted, a new consolidated rulebook was needed. So in 2004, with the release of Dawn of War in the autumn upcoming in that year, Games Workshop released the 4th edition in the August. Compared to editions before, the rules changes were technically fairly minor, the bulk of play following the same rules and methodology as 3rd edition, but with the changes from the aforementioned updates and compilations. There were attempts at clarifying line of sight and model and terrain heights in an effort to clarify how units could be seen with other models or ruins in the way, as well as how they might get cover. Up to this point, a model's eye view was used, and indeed was still used in 4th edition, but there was also the introduction of categories of small, medium and large. These simply let units see other units that would have a greater height or vice versa. This was the only edition of the game to use this system before going back to a completely true line of sight system. Shooting worked in the same manner, with the addition that a leadership check was needed to shoot at any target that wasn't the closest, or the closest large target, just so that your tank busting weapons weren't wasted on a closer infantry unit. Line of sight worked as mentioned, but it is important to note that this edition was the first to explicitly state that line of sight was to the body of the model. Whilst this was a subjective element, the game still mainly operated on the basis of people talking and using common sense, rather than needing everything to be codified into numbers and legalese. The rules outright stating that this was to prevent players from being penalised for having impressive banners or spectacular poses was an incredibly nice touch to enshrine the intent of the rules into text, especially for those looking for everything to be as written. It was also added that casualties could only be removed from those in line of sight to the attacker, making positioning very important. 4th saw the introduction of certain special weapon types, as well as universal special rules, to account for the large variety of codexes and rules that had been introduced throughout the life of 3rd. Things like melter and gets hot weaponry had rules in 3rd edition, but weren't explicitly named as such, rather an addendum to the weapon themselves. Other special rules like feel no pain or slow and purposeful were included in codexes, but were now in the core rules for the first time. Combat was also effectively the same, although units could fight in slightly deeper ranks, being able to fight if they were within 2 of someone in base to base, and sweeping advances were changed now to a straight roll-off rather than a pursuing move. Players would roll a d6 and add their initiative, allowing faster units greater chances of escaping or cutting down their foe. Morale worked identically, but now also included the no retreat rule. Units with fearless, i.e. never needing to take morale, were exceptionally powerful in 3rd edition, needing to be killed to a man and forcing opponents to be stuck in melee for a lengthy time despite winning round after round. This no retreat rule would make these units take additional wounds or glancing hits when losing combats and outnumbered, making them liable to be dragged down by a weight of bodies. Likewise, the crossfire rule from 3rd morphed into the trapped rule, which now allowed units to go around intervening models and terrain, but if they had to double back, they were destroyed entirely. Other slight changes were added to the core rules to represent those added in codexes over the years, such as jetpacks and jet bikes becoming their own unit type, as well as further clarity on what things like monstrous creatures and artillery could do, keeping their rules in singular sections rather than dotted about in the main rules or codexes. Vehicles changed in a few ways, embarking and disembarking now required to be in range of access points on the vehicle, as well as being completely unable to charge out of pretty much every vehicle in the game. Blood Angel players worldwide lamented the loss of the Rhino Rush. The introduction of categories for main and defensive weapons also occurred, allowing units to fire weaker weapons like storm bolters without affecting their turret-mounted las cannon. There were further refinements to arcs of fire and pivoting for vehicles, making them operate slightly more involved but in a more gameplay balanced manner. Damaging a vehicle remained roughly the same, with the varying charts and effects depending on the severity of the hit, but with some quality of life changes. Stationary skimmers like a devilfish now just floated down to the ground when immobilized rather than immediately scattering off and exploding somewhere. Passengers also did not like being inside any vehicle that suffered a penetrating hit, immediately having to jump out regardless of what happened. Lots of leapfrogging and units in and out of tanks ensued. Missions followed a similar format to Third, with the 5 standard missions, each with a set objective to attempt, as well as scoring victory points by damaging or destroying enemy units. There was often a disparity in some of these missions, making games often decided by the sheer killing power of the armies rather than any tactical or narrative gameplay. Overall, 4th edition was a strong refinement of the core elements of Third, adding in some quality of life changes that were ported through to future editions, but some elements were dropped entirely in 2008 with the release of 5th edition. Much like 4th edition, this latest version of the game built upon the foundations of the previous, with some tweaks and changes here and there, but mostly following the same core principles. Attacking units remained mostly the same, again with some refinements, such as casualties could now be removed from anywhere in the unit, not just those in line of sight or closest. Intervening models could also afford cover, making screening now a very real tactic against shooting as well as melee. This was also the era of multi-wound models being able to spread wounds around if armed differently. A novel idea to help keep unique or bespoke members of a unit alive, but in practice resulted in a slow and very gamey system. Rules for blast templates were also tightened up, with partial hits being a thing of the past, but otherwise, shooting and combat remained basically the same. Morale was tweaked slightly for determining combat results, with outnumber no longer imposing negatives. Instead, however many wounds a side lost imposed a stacking -1 modifier. No retreat operated in the same principle, taking X number of wounds for X points that they lost combat by. Once again, vehicles received some changes, with the value of defensive weapons reduced to limit how many guns a moving tank could fire, and arcs of fire becoming more restricted once again, especially for hull-mounted and sponson weapons. The damage table was also further streamlined into a single chart, with glancing hits being a negative modifier to the result, making destroying a vehicle with a glancing hit all but impossible outside of other positive modifiers. Vehicles could actually get a cover save in certain circumstances, and passengers no longer immediately jumped out of a tank that took a penetrating hit. Ramming also returned after its absence since 2nd edition, with tanks able to inflict damage on enemy vehicles akin to a tank shock, but at the cost of moving maximum speed and possibly taking damage themselves. 5th edition reduced the number of missions down to a simple 3, but did introduce random deployment types, so the number of varieties of games did remain roughly the same. Troops also became the only way to score missions with objective points, making them a vital part of army construction. And Deep Strike was also finally allowed in all missions, allowing everyone the ability to enjoy scattering off the table no matter what game they were playing. Whilst not without its issues, mainly from codexes, which is perhaps a topic for another video, the core rules for 5th edition were fairly robust and built upon the previous ones. But in 2012, 6th edition was released, and with it came some significant upheavals. Like the previous editions before it, 6th made some changes in the way of tweaks or minor refinements, as well as reining in some of the more complex elements. But it did also make some quite far-reaching changes, many of which continued into later versions and even into today. Movement remained mostly the same, but shooting received some shakeups and additions. Chief amongst these was the addition of pre-measuring, no more needing to guess if a weapon was in range before declaring targets. Further rules to enable more contribution from units in the game were also introduced, such as snapshots, enabling units to shoot at ballistic skill 1, and these interacted with several other rules changes. Grenades became a ranged weapon again for the first time in over a decade, having been relegated to just improving your combat bonuses since 3rd. Charging and combat also received big changes, with many facets continuing through to today in some capacity. The charge move became a 2d6 roll for the first time, and Overwatch was also introduced, letting units fire snapshots at their charges, and again has carried through pretty much to today. Pile-ins were also given their own distinct step, with all models fighting at a given step making a 3-inch move, much like today. Morale followed much of the same format, but regrouping was much more lenient, checks being allowed no matter the unit strength, although needing a double 1 if below 25. Previously, if you were under half strength, you kept running. Many universal special rules were tweaked and changed, often allowing their rules to carry over onto other models in their unit, and changes to some of the core rules did mean that adjustments to units with subtypes such as cavalry or beasts were also made. Rather than charging 12 inches, they now just moved 12 inches. The introduction of flyers and flying monstrous creatures also happened in this edition. Units which had, until this point, existed only in Forge World expansions rather than in the core 40k rules. And 6th edition would later see the introduction of super heavies in the later Escalation supplement. These 3 new types of units would, for better or worse, go on to shape much of the competitive landscape in later editions. Vehicles also received hull points, a callback to their old damage characteristic in Rogue Trader, and a way of indicating how many hits one could take in total. In previous editions, a vehicle would just keep going until you rolled high enough on the damage table, or did so many stacking weapon destroyed and immobilized results that it just kind of fell apart. Now most vehicles had around 3 hull points, with 1 lost every time they took a glancing or penetrating hit, but only penetrating hits rolled on the damage table to see if they could do further damage or outright destruction. This had the simultaneous effect of making vehicles both more and less survivable, as now a lucky glancing hit could no longer cause significant damage or debilitation, but likewise a vehicle could only really take 3 connecting hits before ceasing operation. They could also fire weapons as snapshots when on the move rather than being unable to do anything at all, and disembarking was now limited again, with models being only allowed to make a 6-inch move, 1 at a time from any access point, and only if the vehicle had not moved any more than 6 inches that turn. Characters also became much more impactful, with the precision ability granted to all of them, letting them choose the target on a 6 to hit, and being able to issue challenges to other characters in melee, forcing them to fight each other to the death, or removing them from fighting for the entirety of that round. Given challengers could only fight each other for that round and unit leaders were characters, this resulted in many sergeants issuing a challenge to powerful melee HQs in order to defend their squad from damage. Psychers also received a change using a simplified version of the Psi points from Rogue Trader, now known as warp charges. All Psychers generated warp charges equal to their mastery level and had to expend 1 to use their powers, which were all randomly generated at the beginning of the game. Enemy units were able to deny the witch, enabling them to actually interact with psychic powers, but only if they were directly affected by it. Terrain became the most codified it had ever been, with all manner of different types and variations being classified as a particular type, as well as what cover save it will be providing. You'll note that I haven't talked about buildings so far, as they were generally quite complicated to use in game, but given this edition introduced fortifications, they and buildings would eventually become much more widespread. This edition also introduced warlord traits and a proper bespoke ally system, both of which shaped part of the game significantly, despite their small part of the core rules. The ally system is an especially contentious one, allowing armies to shore up their weaknesses with units from another faction, often with very minimal downsides for most commanders. Similar to 5th edition, the core missions of the rules were randomly determined, with random deployment types as well, but there were now 6 missions up from 3, and most missions involved controlling objective markers rather than just outright trying to destroy enemy units. Victory points were much more linear, rather than being based on a unit's point value, setting the stage for future missions and objectives in further editions. All of these changes were pretty significant at the time, but the number of expansions introduced caused it to be updated once again, this time after only 2 years, making this the shortest lived edition of 40k. So, 2014 rolls around and the core rules are updated once again. Ostensibly a re-release with the addition of things like super heavy and apocalyptic size templates now enshrined in the core rules and thus no longer optional or requiring your opponent's permission. The overall gameplay was relatively unchanged, with some minor quality of life changes introduced, such as vertical coherency for the first time, and the shooting, combat and morale phases remaining basically the same, as do most of the unit types and special rules. Again, minor changes and clarifications here and there. Vehicles received probably the fewest amount of changes compared to any previous edition change, with their damage table becoming slightly more forgiving, now only being destroyed on a 7+, and so requiring modifiers. The main change to the edition, however, came with the introduction of the Psychic phase, and changes to Psychers in general. Rather than straight up leadership checks to manifest powers and warp charges per Psyker, both players generated them based on a d6 roll at the start of every phase and the total number of mastery levels they had on the table, a pool that they could use for manifesting and denying. Manifesting would require choosing how many charges would be spent and rolling a d6, with each 4 being successful, and each power would have a warp charge value indicating how many successes they needed. The opponent could then spend their warp charges to deny it, and for each 6 they would remove a successful warp charge, although they had modifiers for other psykers that were being directly affected by the powers. If the number of successes were not enough to reach the power's warp charge level, it failed. Given the increased potency of certain psychic powers, they became quite an important part of the game, shaping much of the metagame competitively. Army building also changed somewhat, with the allies table changing to prevent too many overlapping bonuses that had applied to allies, especially from the all-new psychic powers, and the basic combined arms detachment was still here and effectively unchanged since its introduction in 3rd, but it was now classed as a battle-forged detachment, offering command benefits and additional rules versus the unbound format which was introduced here. A much more free-for-all method opposed to the more restrictive army building of the last 4 editions. These would be complicated as codexes and supplements were released, adding new formations which offered a more restrictive set of rules for building specific detachments, but with substantially more powerful rules. The 6 core Eternal War missions were the same as they were in 6th, but with the addition of the Maelstrom of War, using tactical objectives to randomly determine the types of missions to attempt and victory points that were on offer, rewarding an adaptive and clever commander. Given the changes from 6th to 7th were quite minor, 7th could actually devote a significant amount of its lifetime to bringing army codexes up to date and expanding on the core rule set. The aforementioned formations came as armies received their updates and campaign supplements, but over time, with White Dwarf articles and further complexity and additional updates, came balance disparity in an already complex and difficult to balance system. It is perhaps because of this, although maybe not solely, that 7th lasted for just over 3 years, and that the subsequent edition change was as sweeping as it was. 2017, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, 40k had received not just an edition update, but a drastic core rules overhaul. Previous editions, barring the shift from 2nd to 3rd, were similar enough that older codexes could be used, but 8th was so different that this could not work, with many elements that had been around since Rogue Trader being retired. For comparison, the core rules of 7th edition consisted of over 200 pages of rules and appendices. 8th edition began with half that. Certain elements fulfilled the same basic principle or core function, but were just simply streamlined. The weapon skill and ballistic skill system were trimmed back, with the result needing to just be on the unit's rules, no more comparison on a chart, and the strength toughness chart was much more condensed. Importantly, nothing was unable to wound anything anymore, no matter the disparity of strength or toughness. In previous editions, if something was double your toughness or more, you physically could not hurt it. This becomes significant because vehicles revert to a more Rogue Trader-esque version, having toughness and wounds, though without running the risk of suffering weapon malfunctions or random explosions, instead just becoming less effective as they suffer damage, such as reducing their movement or accuracy. Yes, movement is back as a characteristic, the first time since 2nd, as was the damage characteristic. The AP system of the previous editions has also been removed and is now back to the modifiers of 1st and 2nd. Falling back was now an elective choice to move out of an ongoing combat in your turn, sacrificing shooting and charging opportunities, but being able to leave with no other penalty opened up a number of options for commanders. To that end, fleeing off the battlefield was no longer a thing, and instead casualties suffered by a unit just caused other models to flee. A d6 plus a number of casualties minus the unit's leadership. The difference is how many models were removed from play. No more units running away or being caught and instantly destroyed, though it did result in times where, mathematically speaking, you could inflict a certain number of casualties that would simply result in the rest of the unit exploding in fear no matter what your opponent rolled. Psychic became simplified, still maintaining their own dedicated phase, but simply needing to roll above a set value on 2d6 in order to manifest the specific power. Peril still existed on a double 1 or a 6, often with explosive results, where the psyker already wounded, and denying was now solely in the realm of enemy psykers. Shooting also received an overhaul alongside the aforementioned ballistic skill and strength and toughness changes, but units were now able to fire every single weapon they had with no restrictions for the very first time, and even at different targets if they wished. Allocation was also easier, with wounds being able to be allocated to models in a unit even out of line of sight or range. This also extended to vehicles, who no longer had arcs of fire to adhere to, and could instead fire their hull-mounted weapons out of a rear-facing track or a sponsor weapon through the opposite side of itself. Modifiers to hit were also reintroduced from their long absence since 2nd, though without the caveats of being able to hit units on a 7. With enough negative modifiers, units could become impossible to hit. Scatter and templates were also a thing of the past, now represented by random number of shots, and removing any possible argument of what way the wind blew that particular Earthshaker shell. Charging became its own separate phase for the first time, still being a 2d6 roll and still being beholden to Overwatch, but now any models beyond the first charger no longer needed to be in base-to-base contact, or even closer to the intended target, so long as they maintained coherency and stayed out of an inch of other non-target units. Fighting did away with initiative values, instead just the order of who had charged that turn and then alternating starting with the opponents. Otherwise, it followed the streamlining of shooting, just up close. Pile-ins and consolidate moves were now additional 3-inch moves that could be made by models, so long as they finished close to an enemy unit. Combined with the ability to spread out charges, this enabled melee units to threaten large portions of the battlefield or even other units beyond their reach by simply ending their move near them and then casually walking into them. Even vehicles could charge and be charged to keep them in combat. Transports became a hybrid of early 3rd and a more restrictive 7th, able to disembark and embark at any point on the model. Finally, characters became their own truly independent units, unable to join other squads at all, but acting by themselves in the battlefield, being unable to be shot unless they were the closest target, much like in earlier editions, but also having aura abilities that could buff up nearby friendly units. All of these changes streamlined the game massively, but 8th was not without its controversial choices. Mortal Wounds, a way of inflicting damage without needing to roll to hit or wound and allowing 0 saves of any kind, not even invulnerables, were introduced somewhat sporadically at first, being restricted to certain psychic powers or unit abilities, but as time progressed, more ways of inflicting them became added to the game. Line of sight became simpler by virtue of all parts of a model being counted. This did mean that the body clarification of previous editions fell by the wayside, and for the first time players were now penalised for having majestic wings or an outstretched blade. 8th edition also saw the introduction of stratagems, a new resource for players to manage that allowed them to do special moves like interrupting the flow of combat or re-rolling a crucial dice roll. This cost you command points, which were generated based on the type of Battleforged attachment that were used, but as with Mortal Wounds, the initial release only had a few ways of utilising them, but as more rules were released, more varied and powerful options were unlocked. Finally, the removal of universal special rules, only for many units to have them replaced on the unit datasheets, was a sore spot for many. Whilst this was not exactly a new thing, given that this was how the rules operated back in 3rd edition, for there to be many rules with the same effects but different names, especially after many years of unified nomenclature, it resulted in a lot of initial confusion, and the general consensus amongst many players was to ignore what they were called and refer to them as their old rule or give them a new nickname. Eternal War and Maelstrom missions remained as the core ways to play the game, or rather now referred to as matched play, games of a narrative spin or more simplistic objectives being referred to as narrative and open play respectively. There were more deployment maps introduced, and so the variety of mission combinations opened up even further. It's also worth pointing out that, despite not being technically the core rules, all these vast changes required a total reset of stat lines and units, and so the indexes were released, putting everyone in the same playing field for the first few months. Whilst 8th edition purported to be simple and accessible, and for a time it was, that simplicity came at a cost, namely a string of FAQs and erratas explaining and clarifying the rules and how they should be used, and those just opened up their own string of abuses and interpretations. The simplicity of the core rules also became compounded as codexes were released. Sub-factions now became a thing for virtually all of the armies in the edition, rather than becoming the almost exclusive realm of whatever given flavour of Marine was the hotness of that edition. As more and more supplements were released and rules interactions were unlocked or discovered and stacked on top of each other, as well as a hefty swath of digital documentation, 2020 brought in 9th edition in an effort to tighten up and consolidate the game as previous editions had done before. With every army having a codex, and at the very least expecting a supplement, 9th edition was released in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the initial rules offering a huge collection of clarifications and refinements. Whilst there is some debate about how much impact the pandemic truly had on Games Workshop's decision to release 9th edition when they did, release it they did. And despite some community misgivings of this decision, the 9th edition release was unarguably very successful. 9th edition set out with the goal of codifying a manner of the unclear elements of 8, whilst also offering quality of life changes that one would expect from an edition change, removing ambiguity and generally just trying to make people's lives easier. Sequencing was more strictly outlined, hit modifiers were capped so things were no longer impossible to shoot, and the command phase was introduced to act as a home for the many start of turn abilities that armies had received. Examples were more frequent, bullet point summaries were added, and the overall layout was just neater and less ambiguous. Some little tweaks and additions were put in, such as blast weapons being their own distinct rule and the introduction of big guns never tire so that vehicles could no longer be stuck in melee by an errant grot and do nothing for the rest of the game. There was a vast increase in CP, at least initially, which allowed the wider use of stratagems without needing to build in strangely allied armies. And the much more defined matched play mission system did away with the missions held over from previous versions. It used its own distinct and clear way of playing. There were hallmarks of second edition seeded throughout, returning with a shared primary mission but selectable secondary objectives, and the new action mechanic was introduced, allowing units to interact with certain elements of a given mission in order to score victory points or perform bespoke tasks on the battlefield. The 9th edition core rules were considered, for the most part, robust, clear, and accessible, at least as far as 40k goes. It was also overwhelmingly a competitive edition, more so than any other, with the popular maelstrom of war completely dropped from the game for nearly 2 years, and the highly mechanical and methodical grand tournament missions dictated army builds more than any other editions. This focus did come with benefits, however, as Games Workshop regularly released balance and point updates in order to keep the game as close to balanced as they possibly could. This was a task made all the more difficult, however, by their decision to release an incredible amount of supplementary material that added further layers of rules, and codexes became increasingly more powerful and complex, effectively causing the aforementioned balance updates to be required in the first place. 9th edition ended as a deep but highly complicated game, with a vast amount of FAQs and erratas, and a very narrowly focused playstyle that harkened back to earlier editions in terms of the level of rules complexity and crunchiness, which turned many of the people off from it in the first place. And much like 7th edition before, this complexity would prove to be its death knell, as in 2023, a scant 3 years after its promising start, 10th edition was released, and another big reset was enacted. Which brings us to today. Now, there's already a ton of discourse on 10th edition right here on Tabletop Tactics and elsewhere online, and of course in person in local gaming groups or amongst your friends. Given how current it is, I'm not going to go through what you've probably already read over yourself. Although, of course, if you are interested in what we think here at TT, then we've got plenty of videos on the topic and plenty more to come. Suffice it to say, 10th edition has had somewhat of a rocky start. Whilst it has some promising and well-received changes, there have been some which have caused much concern amongst both casual and competitive players alike. But as you've heard by now in this video, it's not really anything new. In a game as vast and complex as 40k, there will always be an issue with X rule, a clarification needed here, and an errata required there. Look, should it be that way? Almost certainly not. But nothing is ever that simple or that easy, especially with as many moving parts as there are in this game. On the positive side of things, we're only a few months into the edition, and there have already been updates, erratas, balancing attempts, points upheavals, all in an effort to improve the game. You've got to remember that some of the previous editions were lucky to have received an FAQ after that many years, let alone months, sometimes not even at all. And you've also got to account for the fact that we've come off the back of 9th edition, which ended in a really solid state balance-wise, but took years to even get there. So all of this is hopefully a good sign of things to come for the health of the game. It'll take a while, but I'm sure it'll get there. Warhammer 40,000 is a game that has turned from a narrative-driven role-playing game between 3 friends on a kitchen tabletop who could literally make up their own rules. And it has become the juggernaut of the wargaming industry. It's played and watched by people all around the world, in the hundreds of thousands, in clubs, in event halls, right here online, and of course still on kitchen tables. There's going to be many more additions to come, and there's going to be many more changes. Some good, some bad. But no matter what they are or how they occur, people are still going to be getting together to roll some dice and enjoy the spectacle of the 41st millennium on the tabletop. If you've made it this far, thanks so much for watching. 40k is of course a huge passion for myself and many of you out there as well, of course. And as you've seen, I can talk about it for quite some time. This video has been a huge undertaking behind the scenes for myself and for my handy dandy servo skull, the Beard, who's helped me out with a lot of the footage that you've seen. We've also got to give a big shout out to our on-demand subscribers who make our content possible in the first place. So consider signing up yourself for tons more content and of course to support what we do. But let me know in the comments below if you've enjoyed this kind of video, if you're interested in seeing more of them, or if you've got any feedback that you want to give as well. Give us a like and subscribe whilst you're down there as well if you haven't already done so. But until next time, I have been the chef, you have been bosses, and I will see you next time.